Good morning. Been a while since I've spoken to you in Library Reflections, and I do appreciate Bob Barnes and Phil Lewis filling in while I was taking a breather. I didn't go anywhere on vacation, but I rode a lot of bicycles, built 2 bicycles, and read a lot of books, so it was a good relaxing time, except climbing the hills on the bicycles. This morning, a reflection. I began with a remembrance when I read this particular text that I'll talk about in a minute of Dr. Ed Harris, who was a member of this church and became one of the deans at Oklahoma State University. He and I used to take trips together and we would go fishing. And I remember one particular fishing trip to the White River in Arkansas. Now, the White River is a very large river. It's a limestone river, kind of like the Guadalupe River. And it has deep cuts in it where the limestone has worn away. And on the first day of fishing, Ed and I were together, not too far apart, but I noticed Ed was continually falling into the river. We were waiting, but he would step in those limestone cuts that went from knee depth to immediately almost 6 feet of depth, and he would start floating away. And he cried out to me, he said, "Richard, how do you keep from stepping in these deep holes?" I said, "Well, Ed, don't you have polarized glasses?" He says, "What good would that do? What do polarized glasses do?" I said, "They block out the glare and you can see the deep water. Here, try mine." And he put them on and he said, "It's miraculous. I can see every deep hole." Well, the next day, there Ed was fishing, completely dry, because he was wearing his new polarized glasses and could see where to step. Now, polarized glasses are, in a sense, miraculous, especially if you're wading treacherous waters. The lectionary texts this week, there are 2 of them, an Old Testament and a New Testament text, and they raise the question of the miraculous. The Old Testament text, you may recall from Vacation Bible School, is about Joseph, who had the many-colored coat, and Joseph, who was his father's favorite. You may recall the envy of 10 of his brothers. Joseph, who was thrown into a pit. Joseph, who was sold into slavery into Egypt. And Joseph, who was thrown into prison. And Joseph, out of all of that, rose to be the second most powerful person, only behind the Pharaoh, in all of Egypt. The second story, the disciples are on the lake, the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus has finished preaching. And he tells the disciples to go on before him and he will meet them later. And the winds come up, and then they see Jesus And the text in Matthew says, walking on the water. And they panic, thinking it is a ghost, a phantasm, which is a Greek word meaning ghost. And they are terrified, and then Jesus says, "It is I, be not afraid." And then Peter says, "If it's you, let me get out of the boat and come to you on the water." And then Peter begins to sink, and Jesus grabs him and said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" In a way, these are two miracle narratives. Those who have compiled the lectionary, I think there's a method in their madness. They want to see different types of miracles side by side. Now, I am not going to try to explain away the miracle tradition in the scriptures. I think to do so would be an injustice to the scriptures. There is no doubt in my mind that the miracle traditions play an integral part of the Holy Bible. They show us that God is active in this world. And too many of those miracle narratives are just inexplicable. Raising the dead, the blind seeing, and the lame walking. But I want to underscore for you today that a miracle is not the same thing as magic. Now, in preparation for this reflection, I went online and wanted to see all the miracles that were being performed in those kind of churches where they promise you a miracle every Sunday. Some of them were absolutely hilarious. I saw one where the preacher comes out and says, "I see a man with a cane. And I say to you, get up and run down the aisle. You're healed." And the man gets up and goes down the aisle. Afterwards, someone interviewed him, and what did you think about that? He said, "It was not my cane. It was the woman next to me. I came here to have my hearing fixed." And on I saw so many things that were no more than tricking gullible people. Chicanery, fakes. It reminded me of snake oil salesmen. I think of that, and then I think also of our life. Life is a miracle. A child coming into this world and breathing that breath is miraculous. Because it happens all the time doesn't make it any less a miracle. It's not magic. Here we are going on months in the COVID-19 pandemic. And aren't we all, in a way, praying for some kind of miracle? Do those of us here look for some magic cure? Some people who offer, if you eat this, you won't get it. If you squirt lemon juice up your nose, you won't get it. Or you're going to get something all right, but not a remedy for the COVID. And when we're praying, do we not look for a miracle through science? A vaccination. God working through women and men of medicine. Now, because scientists and medical people will create a vaccine, does it make it any less a miracle? No, it's the sign of God working through us. I want to address the contexts of these two narratives just briefly. And I think the theme throughout both narratives is that the lens of God, or the narrative of God, is in fact a miracle. The late Paul Ricoeur, French philosopher, and I've mentioned him before. When Germany invaded France, and before we were involved in World War II, in 1940 he was captured and spent 5 years in a prisoner of war camp in Germany up near Poland. He'd already had his education, but it changed him. Why was he sitting? What could he do? 5 years in a camp. And he penned this marvelous statement that I've spoken to you before: without a narrative, all of life is a random sequence of events. Now, what does that mean? Without a lens to interpret life, life comes at us and it seems to be random. And randomness will lead to despair. Ricoeur says there is a faith narrative. A narrative of looking at these events that seem to be random, a narrative of faith in God. And we will begin to see a pattern develop. The faith narrative always is about reconciliation, God and others, redemption and restoration. Now, how do we see that in the story of Joseph? And Joseph was most loved by Jacob. He got that wonderful coat. His brothers were jealous, envious. In fact, they hated him. They grabbed him and threw him into a pit. Can you imagine what Joseph was thinking? What have I done? What does this mean? But Joseph had had dreams. Dreams he believed were sent to him from God. So he held on to that narrative that God would work out God's way. And then the brothers sold him to a caravan, who then sold him into Egypt. And now he's a slave. But he did the best he could do. And he rose in this powerful owner's house. And then he's accused of sexual assault. Unfalsely, yes. And the powerful owner throws him into the bowels of the dungeon in Egypt, where light did not penetrate. And yet, he holds on to his narrative. God is good. God is loving. And to make this very long story short, Pharaoh hears of him, and he interprets one of Pharaoh's dreams, and it became true that God pulled him up to be the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. And in fact, if it had not been for God's work in Joseph's life, it may well be we wouldn't be hearing this message today, because it was through Joseph and Joseph's actions that the 12 sons of Jacob survived and became the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, we come to the very famous story about Peter and Jesus. It's also a faith narrative. It's really not about magic. Let me share some thoughts with you. Matthew is the lectionary, but this event is reported in Mark, the earliest gospel, and also in the Gospel of John. It does not appear in the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Mark, there is no story of Peter jumping out of the boat and attempting to walk on water. Also, there is no story of Peter jumping out of the boat and walking on water. The context is this. Jesus tells the disciples to go on ahead in the boat, and I will catch up with you later. As they are trying to get to the place where Jesus would meet them, a wind comes up and they cannot make any way into the headwinds to pick him up. Now, our English translations say that Jesus was walking on the water. The word, the preposition Greek, epi, can mean on the water, upon the water, but it also can mean by the water, around the water, or near. Now, if we were to choose to translate that word epi, Jesus is walking by the water, around the water, or near the water, while the disciples are struggling to pick him up. We find that there is no magic in this. And secondly, I raise the question, if Jesus is just walking on the water, this would be the only miracle recorded for Jesus' self-glorification. After all, did not the tempter say, throw yourself off this temple and everyone will believe in you? No. The miracle of this is the narrative of faith. Be not afraid. It is I. No, it's a ghost. No, it is I. And Peter says this. And this is where the doubt comes in. Well, if it is really you, let me come to you on the water. Peter's always jumping out of the boat. There are records in the scriptures of Peter jumping out of the boat. Well, he jumps out of the boat. I suspect they were fairly near shore because they could see Jesus. That's where they were headed to pick him up. And then all of a sudden, Peter sees the waves and becomes afraid. And perhaps it was like my friend who stepped off in a deep hole. And that's the crux of the text, is about the narrative of faith, the lens of faith. They were scared spitless. And Jesus says the word, be not afraid. It is I. And they doubted. All of us, I guess, have our perspectives, our lenses through which we interpret life. Some of them may be helpful. We have many narratives to make sense out of what appears to be random. Those who have chosen the narrative that there is no God, I don't know how they deal with the randomness of life. Or those who have chosen the narrative that there is a God, but God is vindictive, punishing, not loving. And when we see someone else suffered, we might say of them, well, that's what happens. You don't obey God. Others say, do what's good for me. I am the center of the universe. So if it's good for me, that's how I will interpret life. And these narratives, and in fact, I would put to you the entire scriptures are about adopting a faith narrative. Adopting a lens in which we can see God at work in this world. I can't tell you, you will then understand why hardships come. I can't tell you why the storms of having loved and then lost break out suddenly. Even the Apostle Paul says we only see through a mirror dimly. But one day, we shall see face to face. And the theme for us to remember during this time it is I. Be not afraid. And I've come to believe that the faith narrative is the only way we will ever make sense out of our days. It is the only way that we will be able to persevere in the tough times. Perhaps all true revelation are intended to show us the shallow waters where we can walk safely, where there is hope of standing firm. And the faith narrative, like those Polaroid lenses, will also show us the deep, where we will wash away in total despair. I conclude with telling you that next week we plan to try to have a go at worship at 10 a.m. up in the sanctuary. Please read your emails. All the rules that follow the CDC and the General Assembly have been listed in that email. And God willing, perhaps I'll see you next Sunday. Thank you.